welcome everybody on behalf of the Virginia Humanities, the producer of the Festival of the Book. And I also want to ask everybody to check their cell phones, make sure that they're turned off. Always a good start to any public event. Thank you. If you want to tweet about this event, maybe not right now, but use hashtag VA BookFest. And I also want to thank this evening's co-sponsors, the UVA Contemplative Science Center and the Insight Meditation Community of Charlottesville, of which I'm one of the teachers at. Now, this festival is free of charge, but not free of cost. So if you can see it in your heart to make a contribution that this festival continues as it grows each year, please go to the website vabook.org and see what might be appropriate to give to allow this to continue and kind of pay forward. There's also evaluations, which you also can find here in paper form, or you can go on the website and fill out an evaluation there. And those are read and used to cultivate a better and better program in the years moving forward. Book sales also support our authors, and Ruth will be available after tonight's event. You can buy the books in the alcove out there, and she will sign them. So tonight's program is titled Mindfulness of Grace. Ruth King was raised in South Central LA, and as she likes to say, in the heat of the jazz, civil rights, and black power movement. Ruth is a middle child of 7 siblings. Now just picture that. And that may partly explain her skills of being so able to effectively communicate with a great diversity of personality. She's also a mother with 2 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. Now, she doesn't look like she could have a great-grandchild.
That's the right thing to say. Yeah.
Now, Ruth's boundless curiosity has motivated and energized her to travel and study world cultures. She has an insatiable curiosity in terms of world culture. She's led and participated in cultural exploration studies and workshops in Denmark, Brazil, Cuba, Ghana, Senegal, South Africa, Egypt, China, and India so far. Ruth was a corporate training manager and senior organizational development consultant with Intel, Levi Strauss, and the TRW Corporation. She's the author of a number of publications, including 2 books, Healing Rage, Women Making Inner Peace Possible, and Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out, the subject of tonight's talk. Her intuitive methods, knowledge, and skill, they weave together the fields of Western psychology, Buddhist philosophy, leadership development, diversity awareness, and mindfulness meditation. I first met Ruth, I don't know, maybe it was 10 years ago now, when we taught a meditation retreat together, a residential meditation retreat. I was immediately taken by her bright light, her profound wisdom, and her fabulous sense of humor. She's a complete joy to spend time with. And she's a national treasure in the field of race relations. So, I warmly introduce to you Ruth King.
Thank you, Pat. Very sweet. Don't take my notes. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy you're here. And I'm so excited to be sharing this work with you and to be back here in Charlottesville, which feels like home on many levels. I'd like to start with this evening by having us do a little exercise that requires you to get up out of your seat and stand up. So I invite you to do that. This will only take a minute and it won't hurt. Maybe a little. And I want you to just turn around near someone, maybe someone that you didn't come with, and just get face to face with them. And just take a breath here. Look around and see who's here. Okay, taking a breath here. And coming into silence. Coming into silence. Is everybody paired? Then with someone you do know, it's fine. All right. If you don't have a partner, just get in a trio. That would be just fine. Yeah. Just make a connection here and just look at this person that's before you. Take a breath here. This person that found their way here like you did. And relax your awareness as you're looking, and being mindful of the person right before us. And repeat after me. If I didn't belong to you, I wouldn't be here. If you didn't belong to me, you wouldn't have come. Your liberation and my liberation are tied together. Your heart and my heart are very old friends. So offer a smile, a bow, a hug, or whatever it is you do. And then have a seat. And as you have a seat, I'd like for you to come into silence again. I'd like for you to turn your attention inward and close your eyes or cast them downward. And I'd like for you to just give some attention to how it feels in the body and the heart, the mind right now to have connected that way. Just turning inward. The body sitting and breathing. And just noticing what's there. How you're feeling, the sensations. What's it like to connect? Really letting yourself settle here, fully arrive in your seat. Giving some attention to the exhale as you settle. And I'd like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. The Monacan native people of this land. Those people that are named, unnamed, known, unknown, past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region. We recognize their continuing connection to the land, to to the water and community. We pay respect to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us. We pay respect to the enslaved African peoples of this land who were bought, held, and sold here, and their descendants, and all people throughout the world in captivity. We pay respect to their spiritual labor. And we pay respect to our ancestors whose unwise relationship to race and racism we inherited. And we pay respect to our teachers and elders, past, present, and emerging, and to the global eruption of young people that are standing, teaching us. And we honor this gathering, all of the people that supported us being here with ease, the generosity of heart. And we honor all of you that came out today. And may we recognize that we all share an aspiration for liberation, to be free in our heart and mind. And the question I would like for you to consider as I talk this evening is, why are matters of race still matters of concern? And what does this have to do with me? So take in a couple of breaths here. And you can open your eyes. Oh, so thank you. I'm going to say a little bit. But know that I'm feeling a lot. It's always a little dance to offer something in a concrete way when you're so full and saturated in the topic. So I'll do my best to give you something you can do something with and think about. So this racism, in my mind, remains one of the most rooted and painful impasses of our time. It's fed through unawareness, through the misuse of power, and through our inability to sit with the distress that it represents when we face into it. It's hard to do. The current injury and injustice we see reflected throughout the world right now around race and racism is the blooming of seeds that were planted some time ago. So we're seeing the blooming of consciousness throughout the world around race and racism. It didn't just start yesterday with this event or that event. It's the blooming of consciousness, collective consciousness. And how we respond to race and racism will also bloom. So a big part of what I'm interested in is us being a bit more conscious about the seeds we're planting, which means we're challenged with looking at our relationship to race and racism, and to the degree that we can see how we're either helping or hindering this chronic fatigue, repetitive motion injury of racism throughout the world. What's our part in it? How are we in relationship to it? The American novelist and social critic James Baldwin left the United States and moved to France because of the racism in this country back in the 50s. And what brought him back to the United States to get involved in civil rights activity was when he saw on television the images of Dorothy Counts at age 15 going to the first black student admitted to Harry Harding High School in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live. This was back in '57. It really wasn't that long ago. But when he saw the image of her being so attacked and mocked by young children and their parents, what he said was that I should have been there with her. I should have been there. We should have been there with her. And he says, what he writes about is, he said, I could simply no longer sit around Paris discussing the Algerian and the Black American problem. Everyone must pay their dues. So a question to consider around this issue of race and racism is, what are the dues? What are the dues you must pay? And when I say that, I'm not talking about getting involved in a bunch of activity as much as I'm inviting you to look at the quality of your actions, because they're always planting seeds. And so the degree to which we wake up around the racial patterning, the conditioning, the tattoo in our hearts and minds, and how that's playing in the world, both internally and in our relationships and with other people, until we're willing to look at that, I think we're unaware. You know, unawareness has impact. So it's so important to wake up around this. So I'm not talking about how we solve the problems of racism in terms of the actions we need to do in the world. I'm really inviting an inquiry around how we look at our minds around it. What's happening in our minds, what's happening in our hearts, what's happening in our bodies when this is something we're turning our awareness to? Or how do we avoid not going there? So what goes with this is a bit of discomfort. We usually need a little bit of discomfort in order to wake up. James Baldwin went on to say in his writing, he said, people who do not suffer cannot grow up, can never discover who they are. So there's a ripening that happens in our discomfort. If we're willing, there's a ripening and a teaching that can happen in our discomfort as it comes, as it relates to race. And again, how we're relating to it internally. So what I have to say to people is that consider discomfort a core competency for waking up around racism. You know, because that's just kind of is what it's kind of a requirement. See, there's too many of us want racial distress to go away without first caring for it, without being touched by it. And that's a bit of a bypass, you know. That's kind of the ideal of working with race and racism, but at a distance so that I'm not touched by it. I was in Charlotte and walking up the street, and a homeless black guy was on the street, and I went in my pocket to give him some money. And what he said to me is, he said, take my flower. He had made this yellow flower out of toilet paper and spray painted it. So I don't know what it was. But it was, here, take my flower. And it was as if he was saying, see who I really am. You know, I know there's the term homeless, and I'm, all of this. But this is who I really am. See my flower, take my flower. And that kind of, those moments require a bit of a pause to be with just what's here right now and how you're touched by it, how you're relating to it. The fast forward of, oh, I'll just give some money, as opposed to let me pause with this person and with this flower he made for me, that he's giving to me. There's something precious about that. So I've carved out race to talk about and write about because I see it as, I carved it out of this gestalt of social ills, because I could easily be talking about being lesbian, I could easily be talking about being a woman, I could easily be talking about any number of labels people give me that I haven't really quite signed up for. But race is the one that's the most entrenched, the one that's just the most avoided, and the one that seems to have just tremendous generational impact on our psyche and on our nation and on the world. Some of the questions I'm attempting to raise in the book they're basically 4 questions that are not about having an answer, but about raising the question. Because sometimes the questions get us to wake up, not so much the answers. But here are the questions. How do I work with my thoughts, fears, and beliefs in ways that nurture the dignity of all races? How do I do that? How do I comfort my own raging heart in a sea of racial ignorance and violence? How do I not go crazy while I'm doing what must be done? How can my actions reflect the world I want to live in and leave to future generations? And how do I advocate for racial justice without causing harm and hate, both to myself, by the way I'm going about it, but also towards others? So this evening I want to talk about a framework for how we can begin to maybe hang some of our thoughts on, and this framework is also in the book. But it's really an opportunity for us to understand how we got here and how we begin to think about this, what I refer to as racism as a heart disease that's curable. So again, the talk is not about how we solve racial problems, social problems, but it's about what we bring to them. The quality of our awareness and our impact that we bring to them. So as I'm talking, I'm going to be using gross labels like white folks and black folks and people of color, just so you can be pointed towards the category, but don't stop there, go a little deeper with it. These categories are not meant to separate us as much as it's meant to acknowledge that separation exists between us as racial beings. So one way I begin to talk about this is what I refer to as the racial awareness rubik. So the rubik has 6 sides, but I'm speaking to it in terms of 3 pairs of principles, if you will. So this first pair on the rubik is that we're all individuals, and we're also part of racial group identities. Some of us know that, and some of us don't. So we're all individuals in the sense that, we came here through a body. We were shaped by the people that were in our lives early on. We've all experienced amazing things in our life, as well as loss, longing, lust, love, all these things. We've had that. We've all figured out as individuals how to navigate our family system so that we can stay safe and belong. As a middle child, Pat is right. I figured that out. I had to beat up the ones older and then protect the ones younger, and I never want to fight. So that's why I wrote a book about rage. But that's another topic. But as individuals, we all share a human experience as individuals. We're all good people. And we've all had loss and love in our lives. And we've all had to concern ourselves with how we belong and where we fit in. And we all have temperaments. Some of us are shy, some of us are aggressive, some of us are, angry, some of us are passive, we've got temperaments. And then we're all part of racial group identities, which means we all belong to a racial group identity, and some of us to multiple racial group identities. And that really means something when we are in the conversations around race. Because one of the patterns that we can see, and most of the things I like to talk about are patterns that are recognizable and we can see, is that when it comes to talking about race, a lot of white people come to the discussion as good individuals, and people of color come representing a group identity that has history and pain. And in the conversations that we're trying to have, we miss each other because we're talking from different voices and histories. So this is a really big disconnect for us in many levels. Also, the second part of the rubik is speaking to racial group identities, but it's speaking to the power dynamic of dominance and subordination, because all racial groups are not created equal. We know that, right? So if I were to ask you, what is the racial profile of dominance in our country, what would you say? What's the profile? Yeah. What are some of the other components of that profile of dominance? Male, money, class, what else? Hetero, yes. Educated. Okay, what else? Appearance. Okay, appearance. Christian, definitely, yeah. So we kind of know this, that in itself is a group identity among people that are in that profile don't identify always as group members. They identify often as good individuals that have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and if I can do it, everybody should do it. Or maybe if I can do it, I'm really the only one that should do it, right? So there's dominant and subordinated racial, and again, looking at group dynamics, looking at racial groupness. So the dominant racial group are white folks in this case. Some of what gets defined in that dominance is dominant people tend to define the norms, control the resources, control the narrative. There's a social presumption of superiority. There's not an understanding or connection with subordinated group members. There's an individual identity focus. And the common mindset is, convince me why I have to slow down and listen and shift here. So that's part of what it's like to be dominant. It's not really seeing or feeling or into the racial complexity of the world that we live in. Subordinated group members, people of color, have a different kind of experience with the groupness. There's a sense collectively of reacting or assimilating to social norms, fighting for resources, wanting social problems to be seen and uprooted. There's a group identity focus. They're aware of being a racial group that is infringed upon. And the mindset that runs often is, you won't get away with harming us, and damn it, you got away with harming us. And this is the kind of energy that movements are made of in our society. So it's important, I think, to understand the power dynamics that are inherent in race and racism. It's not just that we're good individuals, we're all good individuals, but we're also part of a racial group collective that is imbalanced, that has power and impact on other races. And that's something we can wake up to noticing at the collective level. And there's a few dynamics that we can also begin to see around dominant and subordinated dynamics. There's a number of them, but the one I think I'll talk about this evening has to do with the stars and the constellations. This is a common dynamic that we can bring our attention to. So one story I like to tell that points to this so potently is when Michael Brown, the African-American 18-year-old, was killed, shot 6 times by 28-year-old Darren Wilson, a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. So a group of us in Charlotte got together to talk about that, and they showed the clip. And so we went around to really talk about what we saw and how we felt and, you know, what we could do. And a white man in the group who spoke, he said, "I can't believe that guy shot that young man. It should have never happened. He was trembling. He was upset. He was obviously distraught by watching the film." And when I talked, I said, "I can't believe that once again a white police officer has killed an unarmed black young man. I too was trembling, I was shaking, I was distraught." You know, it was one of those moments, right? We had both saw the same film. He saw the stars. He saw an individual incident. He was describing the incident, and it didn't have a lot of color in it. I was describing the Big Dipper. I was describing Chiron. I was describing a whole constellation and a lot of heat that goes with seeing these pain patterns played out again and again and again. And this is conditioned seeing, and this is another place where we miss each other when we come into the discussion, because we're conditioned to see. You know, the white people, most and large, and again, I'm using the gross categories, are conditioned to see individual acts because the mindset is conditioned around individual. People of color are conditioned to see issues collectively, and we miss each other, right? So another example of the stars and the constellation is when people say all lives matter. That's stars. All of us are stars. Black Lives Matter is a constellation. The Me Too movement is a constellation. The youth exploding throughout the country is a constellation, all in reaction to the dominant domain. So it's not so much about Trump, the individual, as much as it is about the construction, the constellation that supports the behavior. It's not so much about Robert Northam. It's that the institution he was in supported the printing of the image. And I think when we can begin to see that it's not just about looking at the individual star or the star itself, we can start to see the patterns of harm that are erupting and have been erupting for many times, over eons of time, with Aboriginal people, indigenous and dark bodies, the immigrants. We can look at throughout the US and at Palestine and Syria and Tibet and Bosnia. You know, and then we can also begin to see the systemic patterns and institutions that benefit from the oppression of others, like the militarized police force, like the prison system being on the stock market. You know, we can begin to see that these are all ways that greed and profit gets fed through our mindset of how we're seeing the issue. If dark bodies are criminalized, then we got to have a place for them, and then there's somebody profiting from those systems. It's what Naomi Klein refers to in her book as the shock doctrine. She talks about disaster capitalist. So that's feeding on something, and racism is one of those core predictable systems that support the perpetuation of racism. So there's the individual can have biases. Racial group identities can discriminate or be prejudiced. But racism lives in the institutions. It lives in the policies and practices and what gets rewarded and values and beliefs. It's in the systems that support racism. And when the institutions are run predominantly by white males, and racial group identity of whiteness has not been vetted or investigated, then the consciousness of being an individual good person is just rolled up into institutional life, and it proliferates. The consciousness around a lack of racial awareness and its impact is proliferated. And that's why we have institutional racism. It's not like a criticism. It can only be a fact if the consciousness is not being raised at the group level. So this is part of what cripples some of us around these issues. The last pair on the rubik is speaking to two structures that support a deconstructing of our racial conditioning in our heart and mind. It's what Michael Yellowbird talks about as decolonizing the mind. And one side of this pair is mindfulness meditation, and the other side is forming racial affinity groups. And these are two structures that support the investigation of our habits of mind and how that plays. So in mindfulness meditation, I'll just speak to that a little bit. There is one of the things that it teaches so beautifully is that it supports us in taking a pause to see if we can be with the experience we're having instead of flipping into reactivity around it or going to sleep around it. It helps us see more clearly, and it gives us a pause to kind of know ourselves more deeply in the moment. And it supports us in developing strategies that plant seeds that are non-harming, which I think is crucial in this discussion. It's kind of like what I want is people to actually be able to have a good fight around race while they're holding hands. Can you just imagine that? And even if you can't actually do that, I want you to imagine it in your mind. If I'm sitting with this kind of insanity right in front of me, can I just imagine holding their hand while I say what what needs to be said? Yeah. It's that quality, it's that intention that you bring. You know, if our fights are not rooted in an end game that's really about our unity, then we're kind of short, our view is a little short. The view we have around this can't be that we're right. That's not enough. It's not enough, because we can be dead right, you know. So this mindfulness practice is really powerful in helping us kind of discern that. And there's one practice in particular that I like in mindfulness where it has this mechanism of where we look at our perceptions in the mind. This is all working with our mind, that we have perceptions, and immediately with perceptions we have thoughts and emotions, and then we also shape a view as a result of that. So perceiving, thoughts and emotion, view, and then the view influences how we perceive. So this mechanism is working all the time, right? So we get to slow things down in mindfulness and see how it works, and then we can see how it works out in the world. So I have a few stories. Okay, so one story is right here in Charlottesville. I was here doing a Mindful of Race training a few years ago, and one of the people in the training took me to the airport. It was the first time I had been here, and stopped at this intersection, and I looked up, and it said Barak Avenue. And I said, oh my goodness, where am I? I'm in a city. What a progressive city to have a street called Barak Avenue. All of a sudden, I sit up straight in my seat, and I felt like I was wrapped in regal African gear, and I had my head wrapped and my head was bobbing, and I started speaking in Swahili in my head, and I got warm and excited, and then I turned around and said to the white woman that was driving me to the airport, I said, oh my gosh, how progressive, the city. I mean, wow, a street called Barack Avenue, this is amazing, And she cleared her voice and she said, well, in these parts we call it Barracks Avenue. And, and I was just so like, I was so right up to that point. You know how when you say something, this is why we don't say stuff, because we know the truth we're carrying might not be the truth that it is. So I had this perception, I saw this sign, I perceived the sign, then I had thoughts and emotions about it, it all felt good, it was pleasant, I was right, and then I had a view about the city. I could live here, called my partner, hey, all in my mind. Until I opened my mouth, right? I'm on the airplane, so I wear this bracelet, these wristbands. It says mindful of race, not there yet. So I give them out, because sometimes when I'm talking to people and they just don't get it, I just pull off one of them. I usually wear 3 at a time. I've given away 2 already, so I just pull one off and hand it over, and and then I just go on. But I'm on the plane, and a woman, she says, oh, yeah, the steward is seating me. She says, oh, what does your wristband say? And I said, mindful of race. And before I can finish, she said, oh, yes, I ran a 10K for cancer once. You're looking really good, And I said, thank you very much. Can you put me in first class? No, I haven't. But we get a little information, we get the mindful of race, bald head, perception, thoughts, emotions, view, and then we're off and running, and we're often wrong. And this is the same mechanism that's at work when the police pull the trigger. This is the same mechanism that's at play when we get in lockdown mode about how we're viewing a certain situation around race. So we need to slow that down and unpack and just be willing to sit with what's here in this moment without the layers and layers of story we add on it to make things simpler. And you may recall that at the Brooklyn Deli a few months ago, the Teresa Klein woman, a 53-year-old white woman, who called the police because she thought this black boy, 9-year-olds, had grabbed her behind. And upon reviewing the videotape, what was discovered was that his backpack had brushed against her. And the boy was very distraught because she went into a rage about him touching her, called the police, the whole bit. And the mother was trying to, So even when she saw the video, the white woman saw the video, she was still outraged about how the mother treated her in the incident. So there still wasn't a looking at this. I think there was an apology, but it flipped quickly into the righteousness of I was still the victim. So Gil Scott-Heron, the jazz poet and musician, he said the first revolution is when you change your mind. So I think a lot of, sometimes our perceptions are right. Sometimes what we're seeing is just the horror of what's happening. It's not like I'm making it up or adding a layer. Sometimes it's just hard to bear. But a practice of mindfulness can really bring some support there. But we can also kind of laugh at ourselves when we see some of the ways we're perceiving. I got this one from Dear Abby. It says, a couple of women moved in across the hall from me, and one is a middle-aged gym teacher and the other is a social worker in her mid-20s. These two women go everywhere together, and I've never seen a man go in or leave the apartment. Do you think they could be Lebanese? So, one of the teachers in the mindfulness tradition that I study, he says, one thing you need to remember, you cannot leave your mind alone. It needs to be watched constantly. If you do not watch your mind, harm will grow and multiply. But this is the best part. He said, the mind does not belong to you, but you're responsible for it. And Nelson Mandela says that when we can sit in the face of insanity or dislike and be free from the need to make it different, then we are free. He was free way before he was released from prison. He was working with his mind and cultivating his heart. That's the medicine we need for racism. Some of the things we can begin to examine when we are sitting in a meditation practice is what's happening right now? What's happening? What's obvious? And we want to see that clearly without the distortions about it, without the story about it, but simply what's happening. We can ask, how am I relating to what's happening? We can ask what racial views or beliefs are fueling the distress I'm having in this moment. We can ask, what impact is my experience having on my heart, body, and mind? What assumptions am I making? Do they support distress or freedom? Am I holding to an identity or view of dominance or subordination? Does this distress have an element of craving, selfishness, or ill will? And in my conviction, in the righteousness of how I'm viewing this situation, what's left out of view? So these are some of the things that a practice, what we're doing is we're actually working on an undercurrent when we're doing the practices of mindfulness. We're not directly solving the racial issue, but we're fortifying our hearts and minds so that we can respond wisely and heartfully, because our actions plant seeds and they're going to bloom. And the last piece on the rubik is around racial affinity groups. And I'm a strong believer of us getting with folks of our same race and same gender, ideally. And being in a dedicated structure of continuing to examine your racial conditioning. And I have a whole chapter of how that gets set up. So it's not a social club where you get together and you're hanging out because you're good people. It really is a deep dive into your racial conditioning. Like some of the questions you might examine are, what are the roots of your racial lineage? And given your lineage, what has your race gained or lost? I think we need to kind of know that. What has your racial group membership protected you from knowing, experiencing, or trusting about other races? What beliefs do you have about other racial groups that create inner distress? And how do these beliefs impact your relationship to race and to racism? We have a lot of questions we need to be asking about our racial conditioning. Sometimes we get together and we want to go fix a racial cause. And I don't want you to stop doing that. But what I want you to include is, what's this got to do with me? What is my conditioning? And how am I burning my heart? Am I burning up? Am I cooking out? Am I burning out? One of my biggest distresses was seeing my great-grandmother pacing the kitchen. I must have been around 7 years old. She was pacing back and forth. She was so worried. And she was worried because she couldn't protect these black bodies, and she had you know, great-grandkids and all of that. She couldn't protect us. And my heartbreak was that I couldn't comfort her. There was no comforting her. And I think what I'm excited about is I think she'd be doing flip-flops right now in her grave, because instead of me worrying myself to death around race, I'm doing walking meditation that's helping me sort out the strategy on how I want to respond. So each generation is handed the baton to elevate the tribe around this issue of race and racism. So what we've all got the baton now, and it's not a sprint. You know, this is a life's work. And what we do with that is really what's important.